October arrived in Utah Territory with a cold that felt premature, even for the mountains. Thomas Whitmore stood at the edge of his wheat fields, watching clouds gather over the Wasatch Range with an expression that mixed concern with calculation. He was 30 years old and looked every inch the successful frontier farmer, tall and well-built from physical work, but with the clean hands and fine clothes of a man who could now afford to hire others for the hardest labor. His wheat stood golden and ready for harvest, representing 6 months of careful planning and considerable investment. But these clouds promised an early winter that could destroy everything before the grain made it to his barns. Thomas had spent the morning visiting every farm within riding distance, trying to hire additional workers to bring in the harvest before the weather turned. Most farmers were facing the same crisis and had no labor to spare. A few had looked at him with barely concealed satisfaction. Thomas's success had made him more respected than liked, and some wouldn't mind seeing his fortune take a blow. By noon, Thomas had exhausted his usual resources and found himself doing something he'd never considered before, riding toward the Apache camp on the outskirts of Spanish Fork. The camp was a collection of temporary structures where displaced Apache families lived in uncertain limbo, no longer able to follow traditional patterns but not yet integrated into settler society. Thomas had always avoided the camp, had thought of its inhabitants as problems to be managed by territorial authorities, not as potential solutions to his own challenges. The camp elder, a weathered man named Niol, whose face told stories of loss Thomas couldn't begin to imagine, listened to Thomas's proposal with an expression that revealed nothing. Thomas offered wages for harvest work, lower than he'd pay white laborers, but still fair by the standards of what Apache workers typically received. He needed at least 10 workers, he said, for at least 2 weeks. Niol considered the offer with a slowness that made Thomas impatient. Time was not something Thomas felt he had in abundance with that storm approaching. Finally, Niol agreed, but with a condition. His daughter Ayana would oversee the Apache workers, ensuring they were treated fairly and paid as promised. Thomas agreed immediately, assuming this was merely about protection against exploitation. He didn't yet understand that Ayana's presence would change far more than his labor arrangements. The workers arrived the next morning just as the first cold rain began to fall. Thomas counted them quickly, 8 men, 2 women, and Ayana herself. She was 26, he'd later learn, though her face held both youth and a kind of ancient knowledge. She was beautiful in a way that made Thomas uncomfortable, not because of attraction, though he felt that too, but because her beauty seemed connected to something deeper than appearance, to a completeness of self that made his own certainties feel suddenly unstable. Ayana met his gaze directly, her dark eyes assessing him with the same calculating attention he usually brought to business dealings. She asked 3 questions: where they would work, where they could get water, and when they would be paid. Thomas answered all 3, surprised by the directness and the intelligence behind her words. Then the work began, and Thomas discovered that everything he thought he knew about farming was about to be challenged. The first day of harvest revealed the limits of Thomas's understanding. He'd organized the work the way he always did, dividing the fields into sections, assigning workers to areas, focusing on efficiency and speed. He assumed his years of experience and his education, rare for a farmer but something his parents had insisted upon, gave him superior knowledge about how to bring in a crop. Ayana said nothing at first, simply watched as her people began working according to Thomas's instructions. But by mid-morning, when the rain had stopped and sun broke through creating humid heat that made the work even more difficult, she approached Thomas with a suggestion. Not a complaint, not a criticism, but a quiet observation that perhaps the work could be organized differently. Thomas's initial instinct was dismissal. He'd been farming this land for 8 years, had learned from successful neighbors, had read agricultural journals from back east. What could this Apache woman know about efficiently harvesting wheat? But something in Ayana's expression, patient, knowing, waiting, made him ask rather than refuse. What did she suggest? Ayana explained that his workers were fighting against the land's natural rhythm. The field had a pattern, she said, shaped by how water flowed and sun traveled. Working with that pattern rather than against it would make the labor easier and the harvest more complete. She pointed to areas he designated as low priority that actually contained the ripest grain. She showed him how his workers were wasting energy, walking back and forth, carrying loads, when a different arrangement would minimize movement. Thomas felt his pride bristling, even as his practical business sense recognized the logic. He agreed to try her approach for one section, expecting to prove his original plan superior. By day's end, the section, organized according to Ayana's suggestion, had yielded 15% more grain, with the same number of workers reporting less fatigue. Thomas was forced to acknowledge that his expensive education had somehow missed something fundamental that Ayana understood intuitively. Over the following days, a pattern developed. Thomas would issue instructions based on his systematic understanding of farming as a business. Ayana would work quietly until she identified an inefficiency or a better approach, then would make suggestions framed as questions rather than corrections. Thomas, despite his ego, was too practical to ignore results. The harvest was proceeding faster than he dared hope, and the quality of the grain was exceptional, but it was more than just technique that Ayana brought to the work. She had a relationship with the land that Thomas realized he'd never developed. She knew which plants growing at field edges could be harvested for medicine or food. She understood animal behavior in ways that helped predict weather changes. She treated the soil itself with a kind of respect that made Thomas's relationship with his property feel almost violent by comparison. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades Thomas had stopped noticing years ago, he watched Ayana kneeling at the edge of his field. She was gathering something, seeds or herbs, he couldn't tell from a distance. Her movements were precise but also reverent, as if she was participating in something sacred rather than simply collecting resources. Thomas found himself walking toward her, curious in a way he hadn't been curious about anything beyond profit margins in years. Thomas approached Ayana as she worked at the field's edge, her hands moving with practiced efficiency among plants he'd always considered weeds. Up close, he could see she was harvesting seed heads from something that looked like wild grass, placing them carefully in a woven pouch that hung at her waist. He asked what she was doing, expecting a simple answer about gathering food or medicine. What he received instead was an education. Ayana explained that this plant, which Thomas had been planning to clear away next spring, was actually highly valuable. Its seeds could be ground into flour that was more nutritious than wheat. Its roots, harvested at the right time, could reduce fever. Its stems, when properly prepared, made excellent material for basket weaving. Nothing was wasted, she explained. Every plant had a purpose, a relationship to the others around it. Thomas looked at his carefully cultivated fields with new eyes. He'd spent years eliminating diversity, creating uniform rows of single crops designed for maximum profit. Ayana's approach suggested that diversity itself was valuable, that the plants he'd been destroying might have served purposes he'd never considered. Over the next several days, Thomas found himself working alongside Ayana more often, asking questions that went beyond immediate harvest concerns. He learned that she'd grown up learning plant medicine from her grandmother, had spent her childhood understanding the land in ways that made his agricultural training seem incomplete. She knew which birds indicated coming weather changes, which insects signaled soil health, which patterns in plant growth revealed underground water. Thomas shared his own knowledge in return, concepts from his agricultural journals, techniques for soil improvement, ideas about crop rotation. To his surprise, Ayana listened with genuine interest, never dismissing his systematic approach, even when it contradicted her traditional understanding. They began to find common ground, discovering that her intuitive knowledge and his analytical thinking could complement each other. The other workers noticed the time Thomas spent with Ayana, and reactions varied. Some Apache workers seemed pleased that their traditions were being valued. A few looked concerned, recognizing that any closeness between Ayana and Thomas could bring trouble. Thomas's regular farmhands, who'd initially resented the Apache workers, now grudgingly admitted the harvest was proceeding better than expected. But they also noticed their boss's attention to one worker in particular, and that observation would eventually reach the broader community. Thomas himself was only beginning to recognize what was happening. He told himself his interest in Ayana was purely practical. She had knowledge that could improve his farming operation. He rationalized the extra time spent talking with her as education that would benefit his business. He didn't yet acknowledge that when he saw her each morning, something in his chest loosened in a way that had nothing to do with agriculture. Margaret Sutherland visited the farm one afternoon, arriving in her family's fine carriage with her mother as chaperone. Margaret was 24, beautiful in the conventional way that society valued, educated, and accomplished. She was everything a successful man like Thomas should want in a wife. They'd been engaged for 3 months, with a spring wedding planned. Margaret walked through Thomas's orderly farmyard, praising the prosperity evident in every well-maintained building and purchased implement. Her mother discussed wedding plans, while Margaret herself talked about the fine house Thomas would build for them in town, away from the dirt and labor of farm life. Thomas agreed with everything they said, while feeling increasingly hollow. The engagement dinner at the Sutherland mansion should have been a celebration of Thomas's success. He sat at a table laden with expensive food, surrounded by the territory's most influential families, formally announcing his upcoming marriage to Margaret. These were the people whose approval he'd sought for years, whose acceptance into their circle represented the pinnacle of what his parents had hoped for when they'd left England with nothing. Yet throughout the evening, Thomas found his mind wandering to his fields, where Ayana and her people were probably sharing a simple meal around a fire, their conversation punctuated by laughter that sounded more genuine than the polite chatter filling this dining room. Margaret's father, Charles Sutherland, dominated the conversation with stories of his business victories and plans for territorial expansion. He owned the largest general store, controlled significant property, and had political ambitions that Thomas's farming success could help support. The marriage between Thomas and Margaret was as much about strategic alliance as affection. Thomas had never questioned this arrangement before. It made practical sense, secured his position, and Margaret was pleasant enough company. But listening to Charles Sutherland talk about land acquisition and profit margins, Thomas heard echoes of his own voice from a month ago, before Ayana had begun teaching him to see value in things that couldn't be bought or sold. The contrast became unbearable when the conversation turned to the Indian problem. Several men at the table complained about Apache camps near settled areas, suggesting they should be moved further away or preferably eliminated entirely. Charles Sutherland led the discussion, arguing that giving valuable land to people who wouldn't develop it properly was wasteful and even immoral. Thomas had agreed with such sentiments before. Now he thought about Niol's weathered face, about the loss carried in every line. He thought about Ayana's knowledge of the land that exceeded anything these wealthy men understood. He remained silent, but his silence felt like betrayal, though he couldn't quite define of whom or what. Margaret noticed his distraction. After dinner, walking in her father's garden, she asked if something was troubling him. Thomas tried to explain his thoughts, that perhaps there was value in Apache knowledge about the land, that their displacement represented loss of something important. Margaret listened with polite incomprehension, then suggested gently that Thomas was overtired from the harvest pressures. Once they were married, she said, he could hire a proper manager and wouldn't need to work so closely with labourers. They could live in town, maintain the farm as an investment, and focus on building social position. Everything Margaret said made perfect sense according to the values Thomas had always held. Yet hearing her describe his future made him feel trapped in a life designed by someone else. He realized with uncomfortable clarity that Margaret saw him as a project to be completed, rough edges to be smoothed, rural habits to be refined, potential to be properly directed. She didn't see him, didn't want to see him the way Ayanna did. The thought appeared before Thomas could stop it, and its implications terrified him. That night, lying in the guest room of the Sutherland mansion, surrounded by luxury that should have felt like achievement, Thomas couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the difference between the price of things and their value, about the fact that he could afford this expensive bed, but found no rest in it. Thomas returned to his farm the next morning to find the harvest complete. His workers had finished the last field while he'd been at the engagement dinner, and now his barns overflowed with grain that represented significant wealth. By every measure he'd used to judge success for the past 8 years, he should have been satisfied. Instead, he felt hollow. The Apache workers were preparing to leave. Thomas had paid them fairly as promised, and Neol expressed satisfaction with the arrangement. But as Thomas watched them packing their few possessions, he found himself looking for Ayanna. She stood slightly apart from the others, examining one of his barns, with an expression he couldn't read. Thomas approached, intending to thank her for her work. What emerged instead was a conversation that neither of them had planned, but both had been avoiding. Ayanna spoke first, surprising him. She said that Thomas had land that could feed hundreds of families, yet he lived alone. He had buildings large enough to shelter entire communities, yet they stored only grain. He had wealth that could ease suffering, yet it sat idle gaining interest in territorial banks. What was it all for, she asked, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity. Thomas had no good answer. He'd always measured success by acquisition, by having more this year than last, by building an empire that proved his worth. But Ayanna's question exposed the emptiness at the center of his ambition. What was it all for? He tried to explain about security, about building something lasting, about proving himself to a society that had viewed his immigrant parents with contempt. Ayanna listened, then shared her own story. Her father had been a respected leader who'd fought to maintain Apache sovereignty and traditional ways of life. He'd lost that fight, had watched his people displaced and traditional lands claimed by settlers. He died believing his life's work was failure. Yet Ayanna remembered his teachings, carried his knowledge, kept traditions alive in how she moved through the world. Was that success or failure? Could success be measured by possessions lost and land taken, or by something that couldn't be seized or destroyed? Thomas felt something fundamental shifting in how he understood the world. Ayanna continued, speaking carefully. She said she'd watched Thomas over these weeks of harvest. She'd seen intelligence and fairness, capacity for learning and willingness to change. But she'd also seen loneliness disguised as self-sufficiency, fear masked as ambition. She saw a man building walls around himself with every acre purchased and dollar saved. Thomas wanted to argue, to defend himself, but couldn't. Ayanna's words rang true in a way that made him uncomfortable. He asked what she thought he should do differently. Ayanna smiled slightly and said that wasn't for her to answer. But she suggested that perhaps before building his life larger, he should consider what he was building it for. Before acquiring more land, perhaps he should learn to truly know the land he already had. Before seeking a wife to complete his social standing, perhaps he should understand what he actually wanted in a partner. Thomas felt stripped bare by her words, exposed in ways that wealth and position had always protected him from. They stood in silence for a long moment, the autumn wind carrying the scent of harvested fields and approaching winter. Then Niall called for Ayana, and she prepared to leave with her people. Thomas watched them go, feeling like they were taking something essential with them. The week after the Apache workers left, Thomas tried to return to his normal life. He met with Margaret to discuss wedding plans, attended business meetings in Spanish Fork, reviewed his accounts, and calculated his profits. The harvest had been exceptional, and he was positioned for significant expansion. Yet everything felt wrong, as if he was playing a role rather than living his life. Margaret noticed the change. She asked repeatedly what was troubling him, her concern genuine but also tinged with frustration. Thomas tried to explain his growing questions about purpose and value, but the words came out unclear, even to himself. How could he tell his fiancée that he was questioning everything he'd built, that a conversation with an Apache woman had shaken foundations he'd thought solid? Margaret's response was practical and, in its own way, kind. She suggested that Thomas was experiencing a common crisis men faced when contemplating marriage: fear of change, last doubts before commitment. Once they were married and settled, these uncertainties would fade. She encouraged him to focus on concrete plans, the house they'd build, the social position they'd establish, the family they'd create. Her certainty should have been reassuring. Instead, it made Thomas feel more alone. The turning point came when Thomas rode past the Apache camp on the way back from town one evening. He hadn't consciously chosen that route, though the camp was considerably out of his way. He told himself he was simply curious about whether the camp was still there, though he knew he was looking for one person in particular. Ayana was there, working with several children, teaching them something Thomas couldn't discern from a distance. When she noticed him, she paused, then walked toward where he sat on his horse at the camp's edge. Thomas dismounted, feeling awkward in a way he rarely experienced. Ayana asked if he needed additional workers. Thomas admitted that wasn't why he'd come, though he couldn't articulate what had drawn him. Ayana studied him for a long moment, then invited him to join the evening meal. It was an extraordinary invitation. Apache camps were generally closed to outsiders, especially white settlers. Niall looked skeptical when Ayana brought Thomas to the central fire, but he didn't object. Thomas sat on the ground, something he couldn't remember doing since childhood, and accepted food that was simple but prepared with care. He listened to conversations in a language he didn't understand, watched interactions that followed patterns completely foreign to his experience. Yet he felt more comfortable here, sitting on the ground sharing simple food with people who had every reason to resent him, than he'd felt at the Sutherland mansion, eating expensive meals with people of his own class. Ayana explained that her people were debating whether to move on or try to stay near Spanish Fork through winter. Some wanted to push south where the weather would be milder. Others argued they'd established fragile connections here that might lead to more stable circumstances. It was a decision weighted with survival, shaped by generations of displacement and adaptation to impossible situations. Thomas asked what Ayana thought they should do. She said she'd been arguing for staying, that she saw possibility in Spanish Fork despite the risks. Some settlers were beginning to recognize value in Apache knowledge about medicine and agriculture. Small opportunities for trade and work were emerging. If her people left now, those connections would be lost. But staying required resources they didn't have: better shelter for winter, reliable food sources, protection from hostile settlers who viewed their presence as threat. Thomas left the Apache camp that night with his mind churning. He rode through darkness, thinking about Ayana's careful hope that connections might develop, about her people's need for basic resources he could provide without any real sacrifice. He thought about the contrast between the desperate calculations happening in that camp and the casual wealth displayed at the Sutherland mansion. By the time he reached his farm, Thomas had made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, he returned to the camp with a proposal. His farm had several outbuildings that sat largely empty during winter. If Ayana's people wanted to stay near Spanish Fork, they could use those buildings for shelter. He had grain in excess of what he could sell before prices dropped. They could have what they needed for winter food. In exchange, he asked for nothing concrete, just the possibility of learning more from Ayana about understanding the land. Niol's reaction was cautious. He questioned Thomas's motives, suspecting charity that would come with hidden costs or expectations. He'd dealt with white settlers long enough to know that generosity often carried prices that emerged only later. Thomas couldn't fully explain his motivations even to himself, but he tried. He spoke about what he'd learned during the harvest, about recognizing that his understanding of farming was incomplete. He talked about the waste of keeping buildings empty while people needed shelter. He admitted, with difficulty, that he was questioning many things about his life, and that Ayana's perspective had been valuable. Niol discussed the offer with his people while Thomas waited. The debate was lengthy and serious, voices rising occasionally in disagreement. Some argued that accepting would create dangerous dependence. Others countered that refusing resources they desperately needed made no sense. Finally, Niol returned with a counter-proposal. They would accept shelter and food, but they would work in exchange, not as employees, but as partners. They would help maintain Thomas's property through winter, would share their knowledge about land management, would prove their value so the arrangement felt like trade rather than charity. Thomas agreed immediately, relieved that his offer hadn't been rejected outright. They negotiated details: which buildings would be used, how food would be distributed, what work would be expected. It was all very practical and businesslike, yet Thomas felt he was participating in something more significant than the contract language suggested. The Apache families moved into Thomas's outbuildings within days. He was surprised by how little they actually needed, how efficiently they organized space, how carefully they used resources. He was also surprised by how the presence of other people transformed his property. His farm had always felt like a machine he operated, all function and productivity. Now it felt like a place where people actually lived. The community reaction was swift and hostile. Thomas's neighbors viewed his arrangement with suspicion and anger. Allowing Apache families to settle on his land violated unspoken rules about maintaining clear boundaries between settlers and natives. Several prominent farmers came to his property to express their concerns, bringing warnings wrapped in advice. They suggested Thomas was being naive, that he was inviting trouble, that his actions could encourage other Apache families to expect similar arrangements. The criticism escalated when Charles Sutherland learned of Thomas's decision. Margaret's father arrived at the farm with barely controlled fury, demanding to know what Thomas thought he was doing. This wasn't just about Thomas anymore, Sutherland raged. Thomas was engaged to his daughter, which meant his actions reflected on the Sutherland family. Housing Apache families would damage both their reputations and could harm Sutherland's business and political interests. Thomas tried to explain his reasoning, but Sutherland wasn't interested in justifications. He delivered an ultimatum: end the arrangement with the Apache families immediately, or the engagement to Margaret would be terminated. Thomas was given 3 days to decide. Thomas spent those 3 days in turmoil. He walked his property at odd hours, unable to sleep, weighing everything he'd worked for against principles he was just beginning to understand. Margaret came to see him, pleading with tears in her eyes. She loved him, she insisted, and couldn't understand why he was risking their future for strangers. She promised they could do charitable work together once they were married, proper, organized charity that wouldn't damage their social standing. Thomas realized that Margaret did love him, or at least loved the version of him she'd imagined, but that version was becoming increasingly foreign to who Thomas actually was or wanted to be. The person Margaret loved was the ambitious farmer who shared her father's values. The person Thomas was becoming questioned those very values. On the second day, Thomas sought Ayana's perspective. He found her working in one of his fields, examining soil with the focused attention he'd come to recognize as her way of understanding. He explained the ultimatum, the pressure from Margaret and her father, the community's disapproval. Ayana listened without interruption, her face revealing little. When Thomas finished, she asked a single question. What did he want? Not what did he think he should do, not what would be most practical or beneficial, but what did he actually want? Thomas couldn't answer immediately. He'd spent so many years pursuing goals set by others, proving himself to his dead parents, impressing the community, building the success that society valued. He'd never really asked what he personally wanted beyond those external validations. Ayana waited patiently while Thomas struggled toward honesty. Finally, he admitted that he wanted to understand the world the way she did. He wanted work that felt meaningful rather than merely profitable. He wanted relationships built on genuine connection rather than strategic benefit. He wanted, and this terrified him to say aloud, to know Ayana better, to learn from her, to see if the connection he felt was real or just his imagination. Ayana's response was carefully measured. She explained that she'd been watching Thomas just as he'd been learning from her. She'd seen someone capable of growth, willing to question his assumptions, brave enough to change. But she'd also seen the weight of his community's expectations, the pressure of the life he'd built. She said that if Thomas chose to maintain his arrangement with her people solely because of feelings for her, those feelings would eventually curdle into resentment when he faced the full cost of his choice. But if he chose based on genuinely changed values, if he truly believed that wealth should serve purpose beyond accumulation, that success should benefit more than just oneself, then perhaps his choice would be sustainable. And if personal feelings for her were part of that larger transformation rather than the sole cause, then perhaps something between them could develop without burdening either of them unfairly. Thomas felt exposed by her clarity. Ayana saw him more honestly than anyone ever had, including himself. She didn't offer easy answers or promise that choosing her would solve his confusion. Instead, she challenged him to understand his own motivations with uncomfortable precision. That evening, Thomas did something he hadn't done in years. He visited his parents' graves at the edge of his property. His father had died 5 years ago, his mother 3 years before that. They'd lived long enough to see him successful, but Thomas wondered now if they'd been proud of the man he'd become, or merely relieved that their sacrifice in leaving England had resulted in material security. On the third day, Thomas made his decision. He rode into Spanish Fork and went directly to the Sutherland mansion. Margaret and her father received him in the formal parlour, their expressions suggesting they expected Thomas to announce he'd come to his senses. Instead, Thomas explained that he could not end his arrangement with Ayana's people. He spoke carefully, trying to honor Margaret's feelings while being honest about his changed perspective. He said that over the past months he'd learned things about the land, about value, about himself that made it impossible to continue pretending he wanted the life they'd planned together. Margaret deserved someone who genuinely shared her vision and values, not someone performing a role he no longer believed in. Margaret's response was tears and accusations. She said Thomas was throwing away everything, security, respect, their future together, for savages who would never appreciate his sacrifice. Charles Sutherland's reaction was colder and more dangerous. He said Thomas was making an enemy of the territory's most powerful family. Sutherland had influence with territorial authorities, with banks, with every institution Thomas's business depended on. If Thomas insisted on this foolish path, he'd find doors closing, credit denied, contracts cancelled. Thomas acknowledged those consequences, but said he couldn't base his life on fear of what powerful men might do. Sutherland's final words were a warning. Thomas would regret this decision, and when he came crawling back seeking forgiveness, he'd find none. The confrontation left Thomas shaking, but also oddly free. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had chosen a path that led away from everything he'd previously valued. The community's reaction was immediate and harsh. Thomas found himself suddenly isolated from the social circles he'd worked years to enter. Former friends avoided him. Business associates cancelled meetings. The bank that had eagerly offered loans now expressed concerns about his judgment. At church, families who'd once sought his company now kept clear distance. Thomas understood he was being punished, made into an example of what happened when someone violated social boundaries. The isolation should have been devastating. Instead, Thomas felt relief. The pretense had ended. The performance was over. He could finally stop trying to be who others expected and start discovering who he actually was. Ayana's people witnessed Thomas's social exile with understanding born of their own experiences. They knew what it meant to exist outside accepted boundaries, to be judged and found wanting by systems that valued conformity over authenticity. They didn't celebrate Thomas's rejection by his community. They understood the pain of it too well, but they accepted him with a completeness that made his former social circle's approval seem shallow by comparison. One evening, as Thomas worked alongside Ayana preparing one of the outbuildings for deeper winter, she spoke about what she'd observed. She said that Thomas had lost his old life, but hadn't yet found his new one. He was in transition, caught between worlds. She warned him that this liminal space could be dangerous. People without clear identity and place often made desperate choices. Thomas needed to decide not just what he was walking away from, but what he was walking toward. Thomas admitted he didn't have clear answers. He knew he didn't want to return to his previous life, but he hadn't articulated what he wanted instead. Ayana suggested he stop thinking about grand plans and instead focus on immediate choices. Who did he want to be tomorrow, next week, next month? What work felt meaningful? What relationships did he want to nurture? Build a life from those small daily decisions rather than trying to construct a perfect vision. It was practical advice that resonated with Thomas. He began living more intentionally, making choices based on personal values rather than external expectations. Winter settled over Utah territory with the severity that locals had predicted. Snow fell heavily, and temperatures dropped to levels that would have been disaster for Ayana's people without shelter. Thomas watched the Apache families settle into the outbuildings he'd provided, saw them create warmth and community in spaces that had sat empty and useless. He felt satisfaction that had nothing to do with profit. Charles Sutherland made good on his threats. Thomas found credit denied at the bank, discovered that contracts he'd been negotiating fell through, learned that his social exclusion was actively enforced rather than passively accepted. The financial pressure was real. Thomas had built his operation on the assumption of continued expansion and access to capital. Now he faced the possibility that his farming business, as he'd structured it, might not survive. Paradoxically, this crisis forced Thomas to approach Ayana's people not as benefactor but as genuine partner. He needed their knowledge to restructure his operation for sustainability rather than growth. Ayana worked with him to develop plans that emphasized self-sufficiency over profit maximization. They discussed crop diversity, traditional preservation techniques, healing medicines that could be grown and traded. The Apache families contributed skills Thomas hadn't known they possessed: expertise in leatherworking, basket weaving, plant medicine, animal husbandry techniques adapted to harsh conditions. Thomas began to see his farm not as his personal empire, but as a shared resource that could support multiple families. As weeks passed, Thomas and Ayana spent increasing time together. Their relationship deepened from respect to genuine friendship to something neither of them quite knew how to name. They were from impossibly different worlds, carried incompatible histories, faced futures complicated by circumstances neither could control. Yet they understood each other with a clarity that made explanation unnecessary. One evening, walking through snow-covered fields under a moon so bright it seemed impossible, Thomas spoke about what he'd lost and what he'd found. He'd given up wealth, position, the security of community approval, but he'd gained purpose, authenticity, relationships built on genuine connection rather than strategic advantage. He'd discovered that the land could be partner rather than possession, that success could be measured in sustainability rather than accumulation. He'd found in Ayana someone who saw him completely and challenged him to become more than he'd imagined possible. Ayana shared her own transformation. She'd arrived at Thomas's farm, expecting just another transaction with a white settler, labor exchanged for money, her people's knowledge taken without true appreciation. Instead, she'd found someone capable of genuine change, willing to question foundations most people accepted without examination. She'd seen Thomas risk everything he'd built for principles he was just learning to articulate. It had given her hope that perhaps some bridges between her world and his could be built after all. They talked about the future with a realism shaped by their experiences. The challenges were enormous. Community hostility that showed no signs of fading, financial pressure that threatened Thomas's ability to maintain even his restructured operation, the fundamental fact that their relationship violated every social norm their respective worlds held sacred. But they also acknowledged the alternative, returning to lives that no longer fit, abandoning a connection that felt more real than anything either had experienced before. As spring approached, bringing the promise of new planting and renewed possibilities, Thomas and Ayana made plans that honored both their pasts and their hoped-for future. They would continue the partnership between Thomas's farm and Ayana's people, building a model of cooperation that might inspire others. They would accept the social costs of their relationship while refusing to hide it or apologize for it. They would build a life together that drew strength from both their traditions, that honored Ayana's Apache heritage while acknowledging Thomas's settler background. The ending wasn't triumphant. They faced too many genuine obstacles for that. But it was hopeful, grounded in the recognition that real transformation requires sacrifice, that building bridges means accepting the discomfort of standing between worlds, and that sometimes the most valuable things can't be bought, only chosen with full understanding of their cost. Thomas looked across his snow-covered fields and saw not property to be exploited, but land to be respected. He saw not wealth to be accumulated, but resources to be shared. He saw not an investment to be maximized, but a home to be nurtured, and walking beside him, teaching him to see what had always been there but invisible to eyes trained only to measure value in dollars and acres, was Ayana, eternal blossom, who'd helped him understand that some things matter more than money could ever buy.